In the early 1990s, a famous comedian, broke, unknown, and sleeping in his car some nights, wrote himself a personal check for $10 million. He wrote it for acting services rendered, post-dated it 5 years into the future, and carried that single piece of paper in his wallet for years, looking at it constantly, long before anyone in Hollywood knew his name. 5 years later, almost to the exact week he'd written on that check, he found out he was being paid $10 million for a movie role. That comedian was Jim Carrey, and that story isn't an isolated, lucky coincidence pulled from a stand-up routine. It's one of the central, well-documented examples used in a quiet but remarkably influential book that argues something almost embarrassingly simple. The physical act of writing something down is one of the most powerful, underused tools most people have access to for actually making that thing happen. The book is called Write It Down, Make It Happen, and it was written by a woman with a PhD in English and linguistics who spent decades running corporate writing seminars for everyone from individual writers to Fortune 500 companies and government agencies. Her work wasn't built on guesswork or wishful thinking. It was built on watching, over and over again, what happened when ordinary people with ordinary problems simply started writing their goals down on paper instead of just carrying them around as vague thoughts in their heads. In this video, I'm going to walk you through everything genuinely useful inside this book. Not some shallow, mystical, just write it and the universe delivers it oversimplification, but the real, practical mechanism behind why this actually works, the specific techniques the book lays out, and exactly how to start using all of it tonight. We'll cover the neuroscience behind why writing something down changes what your brain actually notices in the world around you, the difference between vague wishes and goals specific enough to actually act on, how to work through the fears that quietly block most people from writing their real goals down in the first place, and a handful of concrete writing techniques you can use starting with whatever pen and paper happens to be nearest to you right now. Stick around to the end, because the final section walks you through exactly what to write tonight before you go to bed. Let's start with the question most people have the second they hear a premise like this. How does writing something down on a piece of paper possibly make it more likely to actually happen in the real world? It sounds, on the surface, almost like magical thinking. But the explanation the book leans on most heavily is grounded in something real and measurable, a structure deep in your brain called the reticular activating system. The reticular activating system, often shortened to RAS, is essentially a filter sitting at the base of your brainstem, and its job is to decide, out of the overwhelming flood of information constantly hitting your senses, what's actually worth your conscious attention and what gets filtered out as background noise. Without this filter, you'd be consciously aware of every single sound, sight, and sensation around you simultaneously, which would be completely overwhelming and would make functioning impossible. The RAS is what lets a parent sleep soundly through a thunderstorm, but instantly wake up at the faint sound of their baby stirring 2 rooms away. It's the exact same mechanism behind a phenomenon almost everyone has experienced directly. You buy a new car, a specific model in a specific color, and suddenly you start noticing that exact car everywhere on the road, as if everyone collectively decided to buy the same one the same week you did. Nothing actually changed about how many of those cars are on the road. What changed is that your RAS now considers that car-relevant information worth surfacing into your conscious awareness, instead of filtering it out as irrelevant background. Here's where this connects directly back to writing down goals. The RAS doesn't just respond to physical stimuli like sounds and colors. It also responds to what you've identified, consciously and specifically, as important to you, including your stated goals and intentions. A vague, fleeting thought like, I should probably make more money someday, barely registers as a clear enough signal for your RAS to act on. But a specific, written-down goal, I will earn an extra $1,000 a month by taking on freelance work in my field, gives your brain a precise enough target that your RAS starts actively filtering the world around you differently, suddenly surfacing relevant opportunities, conversations, and connections that were technically always there, but that your brain was previously filtering out as irrelevant noise. This is the core, science-grounded mechanism underneath everything else in this book, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes the entire idea of writing your goals down away from anything mystical and towards something far more practical. You're not asking the universe to rearrange itself around your wishes. You're recalibrating your own brain's attention filter so that it actually notices the resources, people, and opportunities that were already available to you the whole time. This connects to a deeper, somewhat uncomfortable truth the book returns to again and again. Most people don't actually know with any real specificity what they want. Ask someone what they want out of life and you'll usually get something vague. I want to be happy. I want to be successful. I want a better relationship. These aren't really goals, they're categories of feeling, far too broad for your RAS, or honestly for you yourself, to act on in any concrete way. The simple act of sitting down to write forces a kind of clarity that thinking alone almost never produces, because writing requires you to choose specific words, and specific words require specific thoughts. You can hold a vague, comfortable fog of a wish in your head indefinitely. You cannot write, I want to be happy on paper without your hand, almost automatically, starting to ask the follow-up questions your mind had been avoiding. Happy doing what exactly? With whom? Earning how much? Living where? This is why the book treats the writing itself, not just the resulting written goal, as the real engine of the entire process. The thinking that happens during the act of writing is different from the thinking that happens while you're just turning an idea over in your head. Writing slows you down just enough to catch the vague places your thinking was sliding past, and forces you to either fill in those gaps with real specificity, or notice, often for the first time, that you genuinely don't know the answer yet, which is itself valuable information. Now let's get into the actual mechanics of how to write a goal down in a way that's specific enough to actually activate this whole process. Because not all written goals are created equal, and the difference between a goal that works and one that just sits unused in a notebook usually comes down to a small handful of specific qualities. The first quality is specificity. I want a nice car is far too vague to give your brain anything concrete to filter for. I want a 2024 forest green Honda CR-V with under 30,000 miles gives your RAS an actual target, something precise enough that you'll start noticing that exact combination of details everywhere. In listings, in conversations, in parking lots you walk past without normally paying attention to. The same logic applies just as powerfully to far less material goals. I want a better relationship with my teenager is vague. I want to have one uninterrupted, phone-free conversation with my teenager at least 3 times a week, where I ask about their life and actually listen without offering advice unless they ask for it, is specific enough to actually act on, and specific enough for you to know clearly whether you actually did it on any given day. The second quality is writing in the present tense, as though the goal has already happened, rather than the future tense, which keeps the goal perpetually out ahead of you, always something you're still waiting for. This might sound like a small grammatical detail, but the book argues it matters more than it appears to on the surface. I will be a published author keeps the achievement permanently in the future, a kind of psychological horizon line that never actually arrives, no matter how close you get. I am a published author, and my book is on shelves in bookstores places you, at least in your own mind, already standing inside that reality, which changes the kinds of actions that start to feel natural and obvious to take next. Jim Carrey's famous check wasn't written, "I will someday be a successful actor." It was written as an already completed payment, post-dated, but unmistakably treating the outcome as a foregone conclusion rather than a distant hope. The third quality is including real emotional detail, not just dry facts and figures. The book repeatedly emphasizes that goals written with genuine feeling attached to them tend to stick far more powerfully than goals written as flat clinical statements. Instead of simply writing, "I want to lose 20 pounds," a more powerful version might be, "I feel light and strong walking up the stairs without getting winded, and I catch my reflection in a store window and actually smile at what I see." The emotional, sensory detail does real work here, both because it makes the writing process itself more vivid and engaging, which keeps you actually doing it consistently, and because emotion appears to be one of the strongest signals your brain uses when deciding what's worth paying ongoing attention to. The fourth quality, and one the book spends real time on, is writing your goals across every major area of your life, not narrowly fixating on just one. The suggested categories typically include career, finances, relationships, health, personal growth, and contribution or legacy, the mark you want to leave on the people and world around you. The reasoning here is that a life can look successful on paper in one narrow category, career or income, for instance, while quietly falling apart in several others that never got any deliberate attention or specific written intention at all. Writing across all of these categories isn't about demanding superhuman effort in every direction simultaneously. It's about making sure you're at least consciously choosing what matters to you in each area, rather than defaulting to whatever happens by accident while your attention stays narrowly fixed on just one part of your life. Let's talk now about a tool the book introduces called rapid writing, a technique distinct from careful, polished goal writing, used specifically for the moments when you feel stuck, blocked, or unsure what you actually want or what's actually in your way. The method is almost aggressively simple. You set a timer, somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes, and you write continuously without stopping, without editing, without worrying even slightly about grammar, spelling, or whether what you're writing makes sense. If your mind goes blank mid-sentence, you write, "I don't know what to write," over and over until something new surfaces, which it reliably does. The entire point of rapid writing is bypassing your inner editor, the part of your mind that filters, judges, and polishes thoughts before they're even fully formed, which is often precisely the part of your mind quietly keeping you from ever writing down what you actually, honestly want, because it feels too unrealistic, too embarrassing, or too far outside what you currently believe is possible for you. This technique connects to one of the more psychologically honest parts of the entire book, directly addressing fear, rather than pretending positive thinking alone is enough to override it. Most people, when they sit down to write a genuinely big goal, immediately run into an internal wall of resistance. Thoughts like, "Who do you think you are? That's not realistic." Or, "You'll just fail and feel worse than if you'd never written it down at all." The book's approach isn't to suppress these fears or paper over them with forced positivity. It's to write them down too, explicitly and specifically, right alongside the goal itself. If your fear is, "I'll write this goal down and then fail publicly and look foolish," writing that exact fear out in full detail on paper does something useful. It takes a vague, free-floating anxiety and turns it into a specific, nameable obstacle, one you can now actually think clearly about, rather than something that just sits in the background quietly sabotaging your effort without ever being directly examined. Once a fear is named clearly on paper, the book suggests a useful follow-up move, writing a direct, practical response to that fear, almost as if you were a calm, supportive friend talking back to it. If the fear is, "I'll fail publicly and look foolish," the response might be something like, "Almost nobody besides me is even going to see this written goal in the first place. And even if I don't hit it exactly on the timeline I wrote, I'll have made real progress I wouldn't have made by not trying at all." This isn't about convincing yourself the fear is irrational or wrong. Some fears genuinely point to real risks worth taking seriously. It's about making sure the fear gets a fair, conscious hearing instead of being allowed to operate entirely in the background, silently talking you out of writing down, and eventually pursuing the goals that actually matter most to you. Let's move to another core technique from the book, listing. This one is almost laughably simple on the surface, and that simplicity is exactly the point. Whenever you feel stuck on a problem, overwhelmed by a decision, or unsure where to even begin on a goal, you make a list. Not a mental list, not a vague sense of "I should probably think about my options," but an actual, physical, written list, with as many items as you can possibly generate, including options that feel obvious, options that feel silly, and options that feel completely unrealistic. The book argues that lists work for a specific psychological reason. They externalize the problem. As long as a decision or a problem stays purely inside your head, it tends to feel larger, vaguer, and more overwhelming than it actually is, partly because your mind keeps circling the same few thoughts over and over without ever organizing them into a clear, complete picture. The moment you write the options down as an actual list, you can see the entire problem laid out in front of you, which almost always makes it feel more manageable, and frequently reveals options you hadn't consciously considered, while the whole thing was still tangled up in your head. A genuinely useful version of this technique involves deliberately pushing past your first 5 or 6 obvious answers, since those tend to be the same answers you'd have arrived at just by thinking about it normally. The real value often shows up in items 11 through 20, the ones that only surface once you've exhausted the obvious, surface-level responses, and your mind is forced to dig a little deeper. Now let's talk about a particularly important distinction. The book draws between focusing on the goal versus focusing on the outcome, because this is one of the more counterintuitive ideas in the entire framework, and one that genuinely changes how people approach goal setting once they understand it. Most people, when pursuing a goal, focus intensely on the specific method they assume will get them there. This particular job, this particular relationship, this particular path. But the book argues for focusing instead on the underlying outcome you're actually after, the feeling or result you genuinely want, and staying flexible about the specific path that gets you there. For example, someone might write a goal like, "I want to work at this one specific company," when what they actually want, underneath that specific company name, is meaningful, creative work, fair compensation, and a healthy, respectful environment to work in. Fixating narrowly on the one specific company can actually work against you here, because it narrows your RAS filter down to noticing opportunities only at that single organization, while filtering out dozens of other paths that might deliver the exact same underlying outcome, sometimes even more effectively. The book's recommended approach is writing the goal around the actual outcome you want. I have meaningful, creative work, fair compensation, and a respectful environment, rather than the specific vehicle you currently assume is the only way to get there, which keeps your attention open to a much wider range of paths actually capable of delivering what you're after. This idea connects directly to another tool from the book worth highlighting: scripting your daily life. Beyond writing big-picture goals for the future, the book also recommends writing out, in present tense and with real detail, what an ideal ordinary day actually looks and feels like for you. Not a fantasy vacation day, but a normal Tuesday, how you wake up, what your morning looks like, how you feel walking into work or starting your day, what conversations sound like, how you wind down in the evening. The reasoning here is that most big goals, even once achieved, are eventually just lived out through a series of ordinary days, and if you've never actually pictured, in specific written detail, what a genuinely good ordinary day looks like for you. Achieving a big goal can sometimes feel strangely hollow once the initial excitement fades, simply because the day-to-day texture underneath the achievement was never clearly imagined or written out in the first place. Let's talk about commitment, because the book makes a sharp, somewhat uncomfortable distinction between being interested in a goal and being genuinely committed to it. And understanding this difference explains why so many written goals quietly fail to go anywhere despite having been written down clearly and specifically. Being interested in a goal means you'll pursue it when it's convenient, when you happen to feel motivated, when nothing more pressing competes for your attention that particular day. Being committed means you'll pursue it regardless of convenience, mood, or competing demands, because you've decided, at a deeper level, that this goal actually matters enough to prioritize even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable to do so. The book's argument is that most abandoned goals were never really failures of the writing technique itself. They were goals the person was genuinely interested in, but never actually committed to at the level required to follow through once the initial motivation predictably faded. One of the most practical signals of real commitment, according to the book, is willingness to tell other people about your goal, out loud, specifically, rather than keeping it entirely private out of fear of judgment or failure. Sharing a goal with even one or two trusted people creates a kind of social accountability that a purely private, written goal doesn't have on its own. It also forces a useful kind of clarity, since explaining a vague goal out loud to another person tends to expose its vagueness almost instantly, in a way that simply rereading your own private notebook sometimes doesn't. The book also introduces the idea of stacking goals, deliberately raising the bar once an initial goal has been achieved, rather than letting momentum quietly dissolve the moment you've crossed one specific finish line. This connects to something genuinely worth understanding about how achievement actually tends to work in practice. Hitting a goal rarely produces the permanent, settled satisfaction people expect it to deliver beforehand. There's typically a brief surge of satisfaction, followed fairly quickly by a return to your normal baseline mood, unless you've deliberately set the next goal in motion before that initial satisfaction fully fades. This isn't meant as a discouraging, treadmill-like observation about chasing one goal after another without ever feeling satisfied. It's a practical argument for building goal writing into an ongoing, regular practice, rather than treating it as a single, one-time event you complete and then set aside indefinitely once you've achieved whatever you initially wrote down. Now let's talk about how this framework actually plays out for different kinds of people facing genuinely different situations, since a technique only matters if it can flex to fit a real, messy life, rather than just an idealized example in a book. Consider someone stuck in a job they've outgrown, who spent years vaguely thinking, "I should probably look for something else," without ever taking real action. For this person, the most useful starting point isn't immediately writing, "I want a new job," which is still far too vague to give their RAS anything concrete to filter for. It's running a rapid writing session specifically aimed at the underlying question of what's actually missing from their current work, more autonomy, more meaningful impact, better pay, more flexible hours, and only writing the specific goal once that underlying outcome has become genuinely clear, rather than guessing at a destination before they've honestly identified what they're actually trying to move toward. Consider someone who wants to repair a strained relationship with an adult child, but feels too overwhelmed and uncertain to know where to even begin. For this person, the listing technique becomes especially useful, generating a long, unfiltered list of small, specific, low-stakes ways to reopen the connection. A single text with no particular agenda attached. A shared memory mentioned without any expectation of a particular response. An invitation to one specific, low-pressure activity. The goal here isn't immediately resolving years of distance in one dramatic gesture. It's identifying one small, concrete, written action specific enough to actually take this week. Consider an entrepreneur who's already fairly disciplined about goal setting in their business, tracking revenue targets and growth metrics carefully, but who's never once applied this same level of specific, written intention to their health or their personal relationships. For this person, the most valuable move is simply applying the same rigor they already bring to their business goals across the other categories the book emphasizes. Finally, writing specific, present tense, emotionally detailed goals for health and relationships with the same seriousness they've already been applying to their quarterly business numbers. The pattern across all three of these examples is the same. The technique doesn't change based on the situation. What changes is simply the area of life it's being honestly, specifically applied to, and the willingness to actually sit down and do the writing, rather than letting the goal remain a vague, comfortable thought circling endlessly in the background of an otherwise busy life. Let's pause and address the obvious, somewhat skeptical question a lot of people are probably already asking. Is this just a more sophisticated version of wishful thinking dressed up in neuroscience language? It's a fair question, and it's worth answering honestly rather than dismissing it. The reticular activating system is a real, well-documented structure in the brain, and its general filtering function, the new car phenomenon we described earlier, is genuinely well established in psychology and neuroscience. Where the book's claims get more debatable is in exactly how much credit this single mechanism deserves for the dramatic outcomes in some of its more striking stories, like Jim Carrey's Check. A fair, balanced reading is that the RAS almost certainly does play a real role in why written goals tend to produce more noticed opportunities than unwritten ones, but it's very unlikely to be the entire explanation behind any single dramatic success story, which usually also involves considerable talent, effort, timing, and yes, a meaningful amount of plain luck that the written goal itself didn't directly cause. There's also genuine, separate research, distinct from the RAS mechanism specifically, supporting the broader practice of writing things down. Studies on goal setting consistently show that specific, written goals are more likely to be achieved than vague, unwritten intentions, partly because writing forces the kind of clarity we discussed earlier, and partly because written goals are easier to review, track, and hold yourself accountable to over time than goals that exist only as a fleeting thought you had once in the shower. Separately, research on expressive writing, writing honestly about emotions, fears, and difficult experiences, has shown measurable psychological benefits for many people, supporting the book's emphasis on writing through fear rather than around it. Though it's worth noting that researchers have also found this kind of writing doesn't help everyone equally and can occasionally increase distress for some people in the short term, which is a reasonable caveat to keep in mind, rather than assuming this technique works identically and universally for absolutely everyone. The fairest overall conclusion is this. Writing down specific goals is a genuinely well-supported practical technique for increasing the odds of achieving them, grounded in real attentional psychology. Even if some of the most dramatic individual stories used to illustrate the idea probably involve more contributing factors than the writing alone. Treating this as a tool that meaningfully improves your odds, rather than a guaranteed magical formula, is the most honest and useful way to actually use it. Let's run through a practical plan you can start tonight, broken into a few clear, sequential steps rather than spread across weeks, since this entire framework is designed to be usable the same day you first hear about it. Step 1. Find an actual notebook, or at minimum, a dedicated document separate from your regular notes or to-do lists. The book is fairly insistent that goals deserve a dedicated space of their own, rather than being scattered across random scraps of paper or buried in the middle of an unrelated notes app. Step 2. Pick one category: career, health, relationships, finances, personal growth, or contribution, and run a 5-minute rapid writing session around the simple, open prompt. What I actually want in this area of my life is. Don't edit. Don't judge what comes out. Just keep your hand moving until the timer ends. Step 3. From whatever surfaced during that rapid writing session, pull out one specific, present tense goal, written with real emotional and sensory detail, following the format we covered earlier. Read it back once and ask yourself honestly, is this specific enough that I'd know without any doubt whether I'd actually achieved it? Step 4. Write down, just as specifically, the one fear or piece of resistance that came up while you were writing that goal, and then write 1 or 2 honest, practical sentences responding directly to that fear, the way a calm, supportive friend might. Step 5. Tell one person today or tomorrow what you wrote, not in vague terms but the actual, specific goal you put on paper. This single step is often the one people are most tempted to skip, and it's also frequently the one that makes the entire exercise feel real rather than private and abstract. And the most important note about this entire process: none of it requires a special notebook, a particular time of day, or some perfect, uninterrupted hour of quiet reflection. It requires roughly 15 minutes and whatever pen and paper happens to be closest to you right now. Let's do a quick recap before we move toward the close of this video. First, the core mechanism. Your reticular activating system filters the overwhelming flood of information around you based on what you've consciously identified as important, and writing a goal down, with real specificity, gives your brain a clear enough target to actually start filtering the world differently on your behalf. Second, the qualities of a goal that actually works. Specific rather than vague, written in the present tense as though already achieved, infused with real emotional and sensory detail, and spread deliberately across every major area of your life rather than narrowly fixated on just one. Third, the supporting techniques. Rapid writing to bypass your inner editor and surface what you genuinely want underneath the surface. Listing to externalize a stuck problem and generate options beyond your first few obvious answers, and directly nomming and responding to fear rather than pretending it isn't there. Fourth, the distinction between outcome and method. Focusing your written goal on the underlying result you actually want, rather than narrowly fixating on one specific path you currently assume is the only way to get there. Fifth, the role of commitment. The willingness to pursue a goal even when it's inconvenient, signaled most clearly by your willingness to actually tell another person what you wrote, rather than keeping it entirely private. And finally, remember the core message underneath everything we've covered. You almost certainly already know more about what you actually want than you've ever given yourself credit for. The thinking was likely already there, somewhere underneath the noise of daily life. Writing is simply the tool that drags it out of the vague background of your mind and into something specific, real and visible enough for you, and your own brain's filtering system to finally start acting on. Let's run through a few frequently asked questions before we move toward the final part of this video. Question 1. Does the goal have to be written by hand, or does typing it work just as well? The book, and a fair amount of separate research on writing and memory, suggests handwriting tends to engage attention and memory slightly more deeply than typing, simply because it's slower and more physically deliberate. That said, the much larger factor by far is whether you actually do the writing consistently at all. A typed goal you actually write and revisit regularly will outperform a handwritten goal that gets written once and never looked at again. If handwriting feels like a barrier that stops you from doing this at all, typing it is a perfectly reasonable substitute. Question 2. How often should I actually look back at what I've written? The book generally recommends rereading your written goals regularly, daily if possible, even if it's just a quick 30-second glance, since the entire mechanism depends on your brain continuing to treat these goals as currently relevant information worth filtering for, not as something you wrote once and then filed away in a drawer. A goal that's written once and never revisited tends to fade from your RAS's priority list fairly quickly, the same way a new car you've owned for 2 years eventually stops catching your eye every time you see one drive past. Question 3. What if I write a goal down and a year later realize it isn't actually what I want anymore? This is genuinely normal and expected, not a sign that the technique failed. The book treats goal writing as an ongoing, evolving practice rather than a single, permanent declaration carved in stone. Crossing out or revising a goal once you've gained more clarity about what you actually want isn't failure. It's the writing process doing exactly what it's supposed to do, helping you get progressively more honest and specific about your own desires over time. Question 4. What if writing about my fears or blocks makes me feel worse instead of better? This is a fair and important concern, and it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. As we touched on earlier, research on expressive writing shows real benefits for many people, but not universally for everyone. And some people do find that dwelling on fears in writing temporarily increases distress rather than relieving it. If numbing a fear in writing leaves you feeling more anxious or stuck rather than clearer, it's worth pairing this technique with other forms of support, like talking it through with a therapist or trusted person, rather than relying on solo writing alone to fully process something genuinely difficult. Question 5. Is this technique only useful for big, dramatic life goals, or does it work for small, everyday things too? It works just as well, arguably even more reliably, for smaller, more immediate goals, precisely because smaller goals are easier to write with real specificity and easier to actually follow through on in a short time frame, which builds genuine confidence in the technique itself before you apply it to something larger and more uncertain. Before we move on, let's clear up a couple of common myths about this kind of goal writing practice, since these myths quietly stop a lot of people from ever giving it a real, honest try. Myth number 1. Writing a goal down is basically the same as wishing for it, just with extra steps. This misses the actual mechanism almost entirely. The book isn't suggesting that writing replaces action. It's arguing that writing changes what you notice and what feels obvious to act on, which then makes the necessary action far more likely to actually happen, specifically because relevant opportunities stop slipping past you unnoticed. Writing the goal is the first step that makes the following action more likely, not a magical substitute for taking that action at all. Myth number 2. If the goal doesn't happen exactly the way you wrote it, the technique failed. In practice, written goals very often manifest through a path that looks somewhat different from the exact scenario originally written down, sometimes better, sometimes simply different in form, while still delivering the same underlying outcome. This connects directly back to the outcome versus method distinction we covered earlier. The measure of whether this technique worked isn't whether reality matched your written words exactly. It's whether you ended up with the underlying outcome you were actually after. Myth number 3. This only works for naturally optimistic, manifestation-minded people, and skeptics won't get any benefit from it. The underlying mechanism, attentional filtering through the RAS, doesn't actually require believing in anything mystical to function. A committed skeptic who simply writes specific, detailed goals and rereads them regularly will likely experience the same attentional shift as someone who frames the exact same practice in more spiritual language, because the mechanism is rooted in ordinary brain function, not in any particular belief system you have to subscribe to first. Let's bring everything together with one complete worked example, walking through the entire process from start to finish on a single, realistic goal. Imagine someone who spent 2 years vaguely thinking they'd like to start a small side business, but has never written anything down or taken any concrete steps. They start with a rapid writing session, 5 minutes, no editing. Around the prompt, what I actually want from a side business is. What surfaces isn't really about the money at first. It's about wanting creative control over something that's entirely their own, separate from their day job, plus a reasonable, specific amount of extra income, enough to cover a particular recurring expense they've been stressed about for months. From that rapid writing session, they pull out a specific present tense goal. I run a small, profitable craft business from my home studio, earning $800 a month in extra income, and I spend 4 focused hours a week on it that genuinely feel energizing rather than draining. Right alongside it, they write the fear that immediately surfaces. I'm worried I'll start this, put in real effort, and it'll just quietly fail, and I'll feel embarrassed for having tried. They respond to that fear directly. Even if this specific business doesn't work out exactly as planned, I'll have learned real, transferable skills, and the only way to guarantee failure for certain is never starting at all. They tell one close friend what they wrote specifically, rather than just vaguely mentioning, I've been thinking about maybe doing something on the side. They put the written goal somewhere they'll actually see it daily, tucked into their planner, reread each morning alongside their regular to-do list. Within a few weeks, they notice they're suddenly registering local craft fair listings, social media posts from other small creators, and even a casual comment from a coworker who happens to know a great deal about small business logistics, none of which would have specifically registered as relevant before the goal existed in clear, written, specific form. None of these opportunities are new. They were always there. What changed is that the person's own attention is now actively filtering for them, instead of letting them pass by completely unnoticed. Let's talk about something the book touches on that might seem minor, but turns out to matter more than people expect. The physical environment in which you do this writing, and why the book gives it dedicated attention rather than treating it as a completely irrelevant detail. The book suggests that writing, especially the kind of honest, unguarded writing required to surface what you genuinely want rather than what you think you should want, tends to happen more easily in environments that feel slightly removed from your ordinary, task-driven daily routine. This isn't about needing some exotic, perfect setting before you can begin. It's about the simple observation that we tend to think differently in different physical contexts. The same brain that spends all day in reactive, task completion mode at your desk sometimes surfaces entirely different material when you give it a slight change of environment. A different chair, the kitchen table instead of your home office, a park bench, even just a different time of day than you'd normally sit down to do anything reflective. The book is particularly specific about the effect of being near water, lakes, rivers, the ocean, even a fountain or a running tap, which it claims tends to open up a certain quality of reflective, less guarded thinking that most people find harder to access behind a desk in a familiar, work-associated space. Whether or not there's some specific neurological reason for this, the practical observation behind it is sound enough. Deliberately varying the physical setting where you do goal writing occasionally, rather than always sitting in the same spot in the same routine way, tends to produce different, often more honest material than always writing in the same context where your mind already has a deeply grooved set of associations. The broader point is simply this. The conditions you set up around your writing matter, not as prerequisites for being allowed to start, but as levers you can pull to improve the quality and honesty of what you actually write. Writing in a rushed, distracted, half-awake state while simultaneously answering texts is not going to produce the same quality of clarity as writing with even 15 minutes of reasonably focused, undistracted attention. You don't need silence, you don't need a perfect journal, you don't need a ritual, but a minimal degree of deliberate attention to the act itself, treating it as a real activity rather than something you're half doing on the side, tends to produce meaningfully better results. Now let's address a few of the common obstacles that derail people with this specific practice, because they're somewhat different from the obstacles that come up with other personal development frameworks, and they're worth nomming directly. The first obstacle is perfectionism about the writing itself. A lot of people, especially those who care about writing in other contexts, find themselves unable to write a goal down because they can't find the exact right words, the perfectly precise phrasing, the most eloquent way to express what they're after. This is the inner editor getting in the way before the real content has even had a chance to surface. The solution is the same one rapid writing was designed for. Give yourself explicit permission to write badly. Write the goal in clumsy, imprecise language if that's what comes out first. You can always refine the wording later. A clumsy, written goal that you actually read daily is worth immeasurably more than an elegant, perfectly worded goal you're still composing in your head 3 months from now. The second obstacle is feeling that your goals are either too small to be worth writing down, or too large to be realistic enough to write without feeling foolish. The book's position on both ends of the spectrum is clear. Write them anyway. Goals that feel too small often turn out, once written specifically and consistently pursued, to matter far more to your actual daily sense of satisfaction and progress than the large, abstract ambitions you're waiting to feel worthy of writing. And goals that currently feel impossibly large are often precisely the ones that most benefit from being written down, since the specificity of writing a large goal tends to naturally surface the first, small, concrete step that was always available but invisible until the goal got specific enough to be seen clearly. The third obstacle is the belief that you don't actually know what you want, which feels like a barrier to even beginning this practice, but is actually, with very slight reframing, the exact problem this practice is best suited to solve. The book consistently argues that most people don't know what they want not because the information doesn't exist somewhere inside them, but because they've never given that information a structured, patient, low-judgment opportunity to actually surface. Rapid writing is specifically designed for this situation. You don't begin with clarity about what you want and then write it down. You begin with writing, and the clarity tends to follow, often in ways that genuinely surprise you once you've given it a real opportunity to emerge. The fourth obstacle is inconsistency, writing goals down once with genuine enthusiasm and then never returning to them. This is probably the single most common way this technique fails in practice, not because the underlying method doesn't work, but because a written goal that's only ever glanced at once has almost no ongoing influence on your RAS's filtering priorities. The goal needs to be revisited, reread, and if necessary revised regularly, often enough that it stays a live, active signal in your brain's attention system, rather than fading into background noise. Even a 30-second reread every morning does significantly more work than a single, thorough initial writing followed by months of the notebook sitting unopened on a shelf. Let's talk about what this kind of writing practice, done honestly and consistently over months, tends to produce in people who actually stick with it, because the trajectory is worth understanding so you know what you're actually working toward during the early weeks that can sometimes feel like nothing much is happening yet. The most common early shift people report is a heightened sense of noticing. Not dramatic synchronicities or miraculous coincidences necessarily, just a genuinely increased sense that relevant opportunities, conversations, and resources are surfacing in their daily awareness more frequently than they did before the writing started. This is the RAS effect in action, modest and real rather than dramatic and mystical, and it tends to be the first, most reliable signal that the practice is working before any external outcome has actually changed. The second shift, which tends to come a few weeks in, is increased clarity about what actually matters most, separate from what other people seem to think should matter, or what you assumed you were supposed to want based on your background, your family's expectations, or the general cultural noise around you. The process of writing honestly, especially paired with rapid writing and the deliberate examination of fear, has a way of gradually separating what genuinely moves you from what you've been carrying around as someone else's idea of what your goals should look like. The third shift, which tends to take longer but is arguably the most valuable, is a quiet but meaningful increase in follow-through. Not because the writing magically produces discipline from nowhere, but because goals that are specific, written down, regularly revisited, and shared with at least one other person create a kind of low-level accountability and clarity that makes the next action consistently feel more obvious and more unavoidable than a vague, unwritten intention ever did. Before we move toward the final close, let me talk about something genuinely worth reflecting on. The cost of not writing things down, the cost of letting your most important goals remain permanently in the vague, ambient fog of things I want someday, permanently circling without ever landing somewhere specific enough to actually act on. The problem with unwritten goals isn't that they're dishonest or unimportant. Often they represent some of the most genuinely meaningful things a person wants from their life, things they've thought about many times, things that genuinely move them when they let themselves think about them clearly. The problem is that a thought, no matter how sincere or emotionally significant, exists in a form your brain can't reliably filter for, can't hold you accountable to, can't easily revisit without the effort of mentally reconstructing it from scratch every time, and can be indefinitely postponed without any concrete signal that the postponement itself is costing you something real. A goal that lives only in your head can always be thought about later. A goal that's written down on paper has a date on it, a specific shape, and a location you can return to. It exists in the world rather than purely inside your mind, which means it can be held, reconsidered, refined, shared, and most importantly, actually pursued in the specific, concrete way that vague thoughts almost never translate into on their own. Think about the things you've genuinely wanted for years that you've never written down clearly. The career pivot you keep meaning to explore seriously. The relationship repair you keep meaning to initiate. The creative project you keep meaning to actually start rather than just thinking about. The health change you keep meaning to make real. None of these have been forgotten. They're still there, circling. The question isn't whether you know they matter to you. The question is whether they'll still just be circling in 5 years, still unwritten, still waiting for the right moment to be taken seriously, or whether tonight is the night you actually give them a specific written shape they've never had before. The encouraging truth is that this particular gap between I know what I want somewhere inside me and I have it written down clearly enough to actually pursue it is one of the most genuinely low-barrier gaps in all of personal development to close. You don't need money, special skills, an unusual amount of time, or any particular level of confidence to write something down. You need a pen, a piece of paper, 15 uninterrupted minutes, and a willingness to be honest with yourself about what you're actually after, even if the first attempt comes out clumsy, incomplete, or smaller than you thought it would. There's a pattern worth noticing among people who have built genuinely satisfying lives across many different fields and circumstances. When you ask them directly about the goals they've achieved, almost across the board, they can tell you not just what they wanted, but when they decided it, how they first articulated it to themselves and others, and often very precisely what the written version of it originally said. This clarity of memory about the goal's origin isn't coincidence. It's the natural result of having taken the goal seriously enough to give it a specific, written form, rather than letting it remain a comforting but permanently vague intention. The people who tend to struggle most to point to specific moments of decision and articulation in their own history are often the same people who describe their life as something that just kind of happened to them, a sequence of circumstances they reacted to rather than a direction they deliberately chose and wrote down and pursued. Neither of these paths requires any unusual talent or luck to begin walking. The difference almost entirely comes down to whether the intention was ever translated from thought into writing, from vague and private into specific and real. So let's take one honest, small action together, right now, before this video ends and the ordinary momentum of your day resumes. Think about one thing you've genuinely wanted that you've never written down specifically. Not the biggest, most dramatic goal you could think of, just the first honest one that surfaced while you were listening. Grab whatever you have to write with, anything at all, and write it down right now, in present tense, with as much specific detail as you can manage in 2 or 3 sentences. Don't wait for the right notebook. Don't wait until tonight or tomorrow morning. Do it now, while the intention is clear and the resistance is still low enough to step past. Before you go, let's do one short visualization together. Close your eyes for a moment if you can and picture a version of you 1 year from today who wrote that goal down tonight. Not the version that waited for a better moment, a cleaner notebook, more confidence, or a less hectic week. The version who sat down this evening with whatever was nearest to hand and actually wrote it. Imagine the small, specific, compounded effect of that single act of honest writing, followed by the regular habit of revisiting it, having quietly redirected your attention and your actions over the past 12 months. Notice what's different. Notice what feels more intentional, more genuinely chosen, more like the life you actually wanted rather than the one that happened by default while you were waiting to feel ready. That version of you isn't far away or difficult to reach. It begins with one honest, specific sentence written down tonight. The rest follows from there. One noticed opportunity, one taken action, one small follow-through at a time. Thanks for staying with this video all the way to the end. Your pen is the first step. Whatever you write next is the one that actually starts it. Let's go a little deeper into one of the ideas we touched on earlier: the distinction between being interested in something and being genuinely committed to it, because this gap is quietly responsible for a surprisingly large percentage of written goals that never translate into real outcomes. Most of us have a long list of things we're interested in. We're interested in being healthier, interested in earning more, interested in traveling more, interested in deepening our creative life. Interest is comfortable. Interest doesn't cost anything. Interest lets you hold a goal pleasantly in mind without ever being required to actually risk anything on it, because you never committed to it at a level where falling short would actually feel like failure. Commitment is different. Commitment is the moment you go from "this would be nice someday" to "this is something I'm actually choosing now," even knowing it will cost me something, even knowing I might not fully succeed. The book argues that writing a goal down, especially with the specific detail and emotional honesty we've been discussing, is one of the most reliable ways to distinguish between these two states in yourself. When you sit down to write a goal and find yourself unconsciously hedging, writing vaguely, or feeling a strong pull toward, keeping the whole thing private where no one can hold you accountable to it, that's usually a meaningful signal that you're still in the interested category rather than the committed one. And that's genuinely useful information, not a reason to feel bad, but a reason to get curious about what would need to shift for this goal to actually cross from interesting to genuinely worth committing to. One practical thing the book suggests for building the experience of commitment is simply writing the same goal multiple times, across multiple sessions, rather than writing it once and considering the job done. This might sound redundant, but it tends to produce two valuable things. First, each time you rewrite the goal, you refine it slightly, getting a little closer to the specific language that most precisely captures what you're actually after. Second, the repeated act of choosing to sit down and write the same goal again sends a quiet but accumulating signal to yourself that this particular goal is genuinely worth your continued attention, rather than just a one-time thought that faded the moment real life resumed. There's one more practical technique from the book worth discussing before the recap, and it's one of the simplest but most consistently effective tools for getting unstuck when you genuinely don't know what you want or don't know what's blocking you from going after it. The technique is called a suggestion box for the brain, and the mechanics are almost embarrassingly basic. You write your goal or your question clearly at the top of a blank page, and then you simply leave that page somewhere you'll regularly pass by and glance at: the inside cover of a notebook you open daily, a sticky note on your bathroom mirror, the lock screen of your phone. You're not trying to force an answer. You're simply keeping the question active and visible, trusting that your brain, once it knows a specific question is being held open, will continue quietly working on it in the background even when you're not consciously thinking about it, and will surface relevant answers, ideas, and connections into your conscious awareness at unexpected moments throughout the day. This isn't mysticism. It's essentially the same RAS mechanism we discussed at the beginning of this video, applied not to a specific goal you already know, but to an open question you're still in the process of clarifying. Your brain is extraordinarily good at pattern recognition and background processing. Giving it a specific, visible, regularly reinforced question to work on, rather than letting it spend that background processing capacity on whatever random anxiety or ambient noise it defaults to when you haven't given it something more specific to chew on, tends to produce noticeably more useful output than simply hoping the answer will arrive on its own eventually. The combination of all these techniques, writing specific goals in present tense with emotional detail, using rapid writing to bypass your inner editor, nomming and directly responding to fear, listing to externalize stuck decisions, scripting the ordinary day you actually want to live, focusing on underlying outcome rather than fixed method, building genuine commitment through repetition and sharing, and keeping key questions active and visible as ongoing suggestion boxes for your brain, forms a remarkably complete, practical system for using writing not as a journaling hobby, but as a genuine operational tool for deliberately shaping the direction of your own life. None of it requires talent. None of it requires an unusual amount of time. None of it requires confidence you don't currently have. It requires honesty, a pen, and the willingness to write something real on paper tonight rather than leaving it, once again, as a thought you'll definitely get to properly soon,